Well, we are really excited to have Beth Golik here today. Beth is the Operations Director for Key Ministry and the Special Needs Ministry Director for Bay Presbyterian Church. So thanks, Beth, for joining us. Will you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me. So I'm also an Ohioan and have lived here about, over 25 years now. So I think that makes me officially an Ohioan now. But yes, so I'm part of the team at Key Ministry. Also, I'm with Bay Presbyterian Church, which is a fairly large church in the suburbs of Cleveland. We're kind of right across the street from Lake Erie. And so I'm part of the children's ministry team, specifically special needs ministry there.
So we're here today to talk about a little bit about why disability ministry matters and what churches can do to take steps to becoming more inclusive. So can you kind of put into your own words, what is disability ministry for those who don't quite really understand what it means?
When I think of disability ministry, I'm thinking inclusion ministry. So I'm thinking about how our churches can be more disability friendly, more inclusive, so that we are including, we're not making it difficult for people with a variety of disabilities to be part of our church. One thing that kind of has been part of Key Ministry's founding and its roots has to do with hidden disabilities. So a lot of times when we think disability, maybe we're thinking somebody in a wheelchair or somebody who's vision impaired. And certainly there are things that our churches can do to make our buildings more accessible for people with physical disabilities. But I don't want us to forget about the hidden disabilities. So a hidden disability is something that maybe you can't see if you saw a still photograph of a person. We include mental health conditions in there as well. So I think when you think about disability, if you include hidden disabilities and mental health conditions, we are talking about a huge group of people. And I would venture to say that there is not one family out there that isn't impacted by disabilities, including hidden disabilities. Disability ministry covers everything. And one thing, we'll probably talk about this later, but yes, at church, my job is I'm the director of the special needs ministry. However, disability inclusion ministry is everybody's job. It is not the job of the special needs ministry director.
Yes, we are going to come to that one.
Okay.
Let's backtrack.
It's worth repeating, right?
It is. Let's backtrack just a minute. You had mentioned that there really isn't a family out there that's not impacted by disability in some way, but sometimes people don't recognize what a disability is.
Right.
I also know that there are a lot of people who may not understand why it is difficult for families affected by disability to come to church.
Everybody's unique, but let me just kind of share some examples. As an outside observer, and before I became a parent, I was, very quick to judge other people's parenting and family situations. And I think some of the hidden disabilities, it's very easy for folks, maybe they're volunteers in children's ministry or people in the congregation, to say, oh boy, that's some bad parenting there. And that is not the case at all. So if we're talking about a child who has maybe sensory processing differences, so either hyper or hyposensitive. So maybe the noise, the light is just too much for their senses. Their reaction to that might, to the outside observer, look like they're misbehaving. They may, they may run. They may try to escape to get out of that situation because that's what their body needs them to do. And so that could be very hard for a family in a children's ministry setting. I mean, children's ministry, let's face it, is fun. It's often, kind of crazy, fun, noisy, bright colors, lights, music, and that can be super overwhelming for some people who have maybe sensory processing differences. And so that's an example of why it might be difficult for a family even to come in and do the check-in process that's required. It just may be too overstimulating, just too much for an individual, and that causes them to have behaviors that to the outside observer, seem like they're not following the rules, or they're just being naughty.
Yeah. How does that make their parents feel if a child is really struggling in a situation? Like we like to say is the child is not giving you a hard time, the child is having a hard time. Mm-hmm. And the child is really struggling because there's something in the environment that's overwhelming them, which real quick, let me just say, I have sensory issues myself. There's a lot of autism in my family, and I do have the sensory processing issues, and the struggle is real.
It is.
Real. I am someone who can't handle loud volume, or a lot of weird smells. Mm-hmm. And I can just tell you, if you've never had that sensory issues, you cannot understand what it feels like.
That's right. And one thing that I recommend that ministry leaders can do with their volunteers is to some extent, try to replicate what that might be like for a person. There are some like little exercises that you can do to kind of try to create a sensory overload experience, at least to the point where your volunteers can have an appreciation of what that might feel like. And it's unnerving. Mm-hmm. And for folks who that's not part of how they're wired, they don't have these like overload experiences. It's really helpful for them to get that appreciation. I feel like in children's ministry, if your volunteers can understand that is a real thing and it's a real issue for a lot of kids, I mean adults too, but if we're talking children's ministry, a lot of kids, just think of the grace that can be exercised if volunteers understand that. I mean, there are little things you can do within your ministry setting to alleviate some of those intense sensory outputs, or however you want to say it.
Would you mind sharing with us in the group later some of those activities that
Absolutely.
Volunteers?
Sure.
That would be awesome. And also, if you want to send some ways that people can alleviate some of the sensory issues for those kids, that would be super helpful. Let's say you have a child who has sensory issues who you don't recognize that's what is going on and it looks like they're misbehaving. What impact does that have on their family when you have to page the mom, and again, not really understanding what the issue is? Do those families like to continue going to church?
Most likely not. I mean, as a parent, if it just becomes so difficult, and if I'm feeling like my child isn't wanted and appreciated, you're not going to come.
Right.
And that's just, it's unacceptable.
Oh.
So one thing that I like to do is I like to ask parents up front a little bit of information about their child. And so I always started out with a very positive question, like, tell me something you love about your child, or, what makes your child unique and special? Because really that's, like, we really want to focus on that. And we want parents to know how much we want their child part of our environment. But you can ask questions, ask for if there are specific situations or specific environments that may cause their child to feel uneasy or that type of thing. And then what are some strategies that are used at home to, help alleviate the situation? Yeah, I'm a very firm believer in, if they're doing something at home or at school, and if we can replicate that at church and just have that consistency, that makes it a better situation for everybody. And I think that can really help the child out if they're hearing the same message or seeing the same visual in every in each
Yeah.
setting.
What if a child is struggling but does not have an identified disability?
So that's where it's really important to have this understanding of what some of these hidden disabilities may look like on a Sunday morning, so that you can put some of these little changes or accommodations in place and make it a more successful morning for the student and for your volunteers as well.
I agree. We have the same philosophy at our church, everything you just said. And so I'm curious if this is your same experience at your church, but one of the things that we do is we do have our own special needs ministry, but we work hand in hand with our children's ministry director to educate all of our volunteers, not just our special needs ministry volunteers, but to help everyone be able to better recognize what is really going on and have some at least key things they can do.
That's hugely important.
I've talked to a lot of people who wanted to start special needs ministry, become more inclusive ministry at their church, and they run into the roadblock that they don't know how to approach their church leadership. And one thing I've heard over and over and over again is that some of the leaderships will say, well, there's no one in our church that needs this, so we don't need to do it. What do you say to that?
Well, so I would say two things. So statistically speaking, there's just no way. Okay. Secondly, if you're not seeing a lot of people with disabilities at your church, maybe it's because your church isn't so welcoming. So, because they're there, I guarantee you. And again, I think people are sometimes kind of have a narrow thinking of what disability is and aren't thinking of hidden disabilities and mental health conditions. But
I think you're right.
The people are there, and so you need to make sure that your church is a welcoming place.
Right.
As far as, how do you get started? How do you get church leadership on board? So Key Ministry has some really great articles from our blogs, and we've actually compiled them. So I'm going to just hold this up right here. But we put together a checklist. So if you go to keyministry.org and click to the churches tab, the For Churches tab, you can actually print out this checklist, and you can go to each of these steps that we've created. And step one is get the big picture, and part of that is helping your church leadership see why this is so important. And some of my favorite resources in that section are from blog posts from families about what it's like for them and what they need from churches.
Right.
And I think it's great background for each of us to have, and it's also very helpful ammunition if we are approaching our senior leadership.
I agree. Again, we have the same philosophy, but I think that it's really about stories. Mm-hmm. When you are approaching, it's not, you want to know your statistics and your facts and why you need this, and that's important, but it's really about the heart of it. It's about the stories of the real people. And I think it's important to kind of look in your church and see who does have a hidden disability, who is struggling, because like you said, they're there already. We just maybe aren't putting that recognition on it.
Right.
But hearing from these people, and then also connecting it back to why is this biblical? Because disability ministry definitely is. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I kind of see it from it's a two-prong thing. Mm-hmm. So clearly, our job is to go out and share the gospel message with everybody.
Right.
And it's not limited to children who can sit quietly and listen during Sunday school. It's right. Everybody. But more importantly, I think, maybe as important, we'll put it that way, as important, our churches are missing out if we don't have people with disabilities as a very active, living part of every part of our church family, church structure. We're missing out. The church is missing out, and that's biblical.
Yeah.
So this isn't just like a good idea. This is what we are called to do.
Well, that kind of leads into my next question. How does it change a church if they do become more inclusive? What impact does that have on the rest of the congregation?
I don't know. I just feel like it's a heart change for the church.
Yeah.
For the better.
Yeah.
And I think it's at a very individual level as well as at a corporate level.
I agree. Yeah, I can tell you, growing up in a family affected by disability with my brother who has autism, had lots of behavior issues. I know this is unusual, but church was the only place we could go. He did not have a fit.
Interesting.
That never happens, but that is my story. He never had a fit at church, and it was like the one place where we could feel normal. And so I would say for churches, if you're not someone who has been personally affected by a disability that is significantly impacts your life, which I agree with you, Beth, a lot of times comes with those hidden disabilities or the disabilities that have behavioral issues with them. You can't possibly understand how meaningful it is for the church to be accepting and loving. And they don't have to have all the answers.
Right.
They just have to be willing to be okay with keep walking with you.
Right. And that's I mean, as Christian brothers and sisters, I mean, do we ever have all the answers for each other?
I know.
But it's being able to do life with each other and just kind of meet people where they're at. And I don't know, I just feel so strongly about it that we all have this part to play in our church family, and so everybody needs a seat at that table. What's also, though, really important to think about is how much volunteers have been impacted by being part of like a special needs ministry or just being part of like the inclusive ministry environment.
You know what we found at our church, and I'm sure this is the same for all churches that do the volunteer training. Even volunteers tell us that the training has made them better parents.
Yes. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I'm a big believer in lifelong learning. Like you can never should never stop learning. Right. And I wish I had been able to take some of this training back when I was a younger parent than I am now. Yeah, for sure. But I think, whether the church's involvement in this type of ministry, whether it's like through a big event, for some churches, their first foray into this might be like a Tim Tebow Foundation Night to Shine prom, because some churches start with something like that before they really start weaving it into everyday life at the church. But that can be a really impactful, powerful experience for a church and for the volunteers.
Let's switch gears really quick.
Okay.
So right now we kind of are coming through still this pandemic season. Everything has changed. And one of the things that has changed for churches is that they have a lot of times less resources than before, less volunteers. And some people a lot of churches will be looking at reduced budgets, unfortunately. So why would it be still important for a church to invest in inclusiveness and disability ministry now?
So we, leaders in the disability ministry community, have been meeting through the Key Ministry Idea Share, and everybody's invited. But it's a roundtable that during the pandemic, when it started back in March, we were meeting every single week to go through, how in the world do we do ministry when we can't even be in our buildings?
Right.
And now we're meeting once a month. And I mean, still, we're all of our churches are struggling with this, right? We're struggling with, in some areas of the country, you're still not back in your buildings.
Right.
For some churches, you are seeing, reduced budgets. Maybe if you were a paid, if your special needs ministry or whatever it's called, it was a paid position, it may be reduced or gone.
Yeah.
So this is what you said is a very real thing, and we're seeing that. But we feel that we need to make sure that our churches are still welcoming places for everyone, including families affected by disability.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that Key Ministry is really doing is first of all recognizing the challenges that churches are facing, and starting these discussions of, okay, how can we continue this type of ministry, this creating this welcoming environment with fewer staff, fewer volunteers, less money. How can we do these things because it's important?
Right.
And on the flips, well, I don't know if this is the flip side, but related to the pandemic, there have been some really, really cool new ministry initiatives that have come out because of the pandemic, that we have seen churches put into place. Mm-hmm. You know me, I call them pandemic blessings.
Yeah, right. Because
these are things that we never would have attempted to do before.
Right.
But suddenly, when we needed a new way to reach our families and reach our students, and churches have been super creative, and I think there's been some real success stories along the way.
So if you're in a church where you don't have the special needs ministry or the inclusiveness initiative yet, what would you tell them during this time? What would be their first step to figure out how to kind of get started in this pandemic time?
Right. Well, one thing that churches can do, and again, let's put aside, kind of children's ministry, special needs ministry for a second, but let's talk about just some inclusive ministry things as a whole. But one of the things that churches can do, so many churches offer support groups and have figured out how to do these, online or hybrid at this point. These are things that they need to share. They need to put those on their website and let people know that they have these resources. I think another pandemic blessing has been that as more and more, mental health is sort of risen as a topic that we can now talk about,
right?
Because it's just the impacts have been so heavy during the pandemic, and so finally it's being addressed from the pulpit, and that is really important. Our congregations need to hear from our leadership that mental health struggles are real, and it's not a sin. These are things that you can get help for. So even little things like that, I think, are things that a church can do to be more welcoming to to folks maybe that are impacted by mental health conditions.
That's actually a big thing. I think it's a big thing because people talk about hiding things. A lot of people hide their struggles. And I was talking to a friend of mine that's a counselor, and she said, right now, everyone, no matter who you are, is in this low-level trauma from this whole pandemic. And sometimes it kind of creeps up on you. You don't quite realize how heavy it's getting. And then for those people who already have some mental health issues on top of it, it's been really difficult. So to what you're saying, as a church, embrace people and let them know it's okay to not be okay sometimes, and that we love you and that here's some resources for you. That's tremendously huge.
Yeah, it's a role that the church needs to play right now, for sure.
I agree.
So one thing that's interesting to note, so a year ago when we went into lockdown, for a lot of people, that was a complete shift in their life. It was a 180. They went from, no restrictions to being home all the time, to not being able to leave their house, do their normal whatever it is that they do. But for some of our special needs families, that isolation was what their lives were like a lot of the time. And so interestingly enough, some of our families, at the beginning of lockdown, it was no big deal for them because it was kind of what their life experience generally had been. I think as the pandemic wore on, we're all really sick of it, but I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing to talk, to think about.
Well, it is, and I would just add to that, again, growing up in a special needs family back in the long time ago, before there was a lot of awareness and resources, our family got isolated. I mean, not myself so much because I was in school, but for my mom and my brother, it could be very isolating. And so I really want people to pause on this for just a moment. If you have not had that experience of feeling alone before, but you're feeling it now, really think about that is how people live, and what a difference does it make when someone reaches out through that? Right? Because I really want to get this point across, that whether the people are still at home worshiping or they're back in our church or whatever is going on, we as a church still have an opportunity to reach out and make a difference. And I know you have talked about that a lot, kind of with the pandemic blessings and different things. Can you tell us a little bit about what you guys have been seeing or doing and how it's going?
Sure. So one of my favorite things to share is that even though we are back in the building now in a very limited way and with very few students, because a lot of our families aren't ready to come back yet, but we early on in the pandemic, or very early on, like I want to say last March, we started a weekly Zoom with the students that normally back in the old days would have been in person. And so I Zoom with them once a week, not long, 15-20 minutes. We do that week's Bible story. Well, we talk about the week. We do the week's Bible story. We do some songs. We take some prayer requests. It's a variety of students. I mean, some are nonverbal, some are quite chatty, everything in between. And it has been such a blessing to me, first of all. I mean, it's literally like my favorite time of the week. But we have gained 2 new students that did not come to our Sunday morning program prior to, the pandemic, prior to March of last year. So, like, how cool is that we've had the opportunity to reach new people? I mean, I guarantee you, if it had not been for the Rona, I would not have started a Zoom class.
I'm sure.
It wouldn't have even occurred to me to do a Zoom class. And now, we've added this thing, we've added students, and it's just been great.
When it comes to churches that want to learn more, what is the first step they should do?
I think, part of it is getting senior leadership on board for sure. But really, I think you need to start with prayer. And that's personally, and I would suggest, getting a group to start praying for this ministry, and really, ask God to go before you in what you're doing, and, open the right doors and kind of lead you in the direction, so you're not trying to do this on your own. And I think a lot of people that are probably thinking about getting started already have, they're feeling called to do this most likely. Right. And whether it's because they have a child and are not feeling like the church is ready for them, or, maybe that's not the case at all. Whatever the case is, they're probably feeling a nudge, they're probably feeling a calling. So, and then, use these resources that Wonderful Works has, that Key Ministry has, and reach out to other churches. I mean, as ministry leaders, we love to help other churches get going with this. And there's so many great resources out there. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. But, take it to prayer, kind of look at your church environment, your church culture, understand sort of the basics of like theology when it comes to disability, and lean on some other, lean on organizations like yours and mine, and other ministries to help you, take that next step, whatever it may be.
I would just add to that, don't compare yourself to other churches.
Big time. Right.
That's a big one. And have faith that if you pray and you ask people to pray for God to lay his mission on your heart, he will be the one for you. And as we talked about before, disability ministry looks a lot of different ways with a lot of different models. So you do start with one that is the right one for your church. All right, so Beth, I have one more question for you. Right now, during this season of change, there are a lot of leaders who are feeling discouraged. So what would you tell them, and what really encourages you and inspires you when you're kind of going through those ups and downs of ministry? Because no matter how good your ministry is hard, and it will have its ups and its downs, and sometimes have those days where you feel like, do I keep going forward? What would you tell those leaders?
Yeah. Well, and there's so many unknowns right now that even if we thought we had our act together, things change. So, no, I would say have your network of people and check in with them on a regular basis. I, each month am part of this Key Ministry Idea Share. So it's a round table and everybody's invited. We do it on Zoom. If you go to keyministry.org and click on the events tab, you can register. But this has been such an incredible tool for me, because first of all, I get encouragement from these leaders. So we usually have about 25 or more leaders from around the country each month. But I also just love to hear them encourage each other. So we have ministries from, East Coast to West Coast, all different phases of reopening. And so, all different kinds of issues that we're dealing with, right? And they have just been so incredibly helpful to each other. We can't do this alone. And you need to have somebody who understands the specific issues that you may be dealing with in your ministry.
I agree. Anytime that you can connect, especially right now, it is the best thing you can do.
Absolutely.
Before we go, can you tell us a little bit about Key Ministries?
Sure. So we are an organization that has been around over 18 years. And again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, our roots are in those hidden disabilities and mental health conditions. But we help equip churches to welcome families affected by disability. So we're really just trying to get families to be part of local churches, and our overall mission is to make disciples for Jesus Christ. So it's making those connections, helping churches be ready to welcome families. And I think a lot of how people know us is from our blog posts. So if you go to keyministry.org, we actually have two blogs. So we have one that's for ministry leaders and one that's special needs parenting. So a lot of people have heard of us because of those.
Well, those are great blog posts, so everyone should be checking them out for sure. Well, Beth, thank you so much for joining us. This has been great.
Fun.